A new power is rising from the ruins of the past, ready to challenge everything we know about the world. Experience the epic scale of our latest cinematic series, where legends are forged and titans rise. Subscribe today and witness the beginning of a brand new era.
It was 6:47 in the morning when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I almost didn't pick it up. I'd been working a double shift the night before, 12 hours on my feet at the hospital, then another 2 hours of charting I didn't get paid for, and I had maybe 4 hours of sleep in me when the alert went off. It was the doorbell camera, motion detected at the front porch. I figured it was a delivery. Amazon, maybe. Or a neighbor's dog loose again. I rolled over and opened the app. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. My grandfather was sitting on my front steps in the November dark, wearing the thin cardigan he always wore to Sunday dinners, the gray one with the buttons my grandmother had sewn back on 3 times. He had a plastic grocery bag in each hand. That was it. 2 grocery bags. He was 81 years old. It was 29 degrees outside. And he had been left there like something someone forgot to bring inside before a storm. I was already out of bed before I finished watching the clip. When I opened the front door, he looked up at me, and the first thing he said, the very first thing, before I could say a word, was, "I'm sorry to trouble you, sweetheart. I know it's early." I couldn't speak for a second. I just stood there, in my socks on the cold concrete, and looked at this man who had taught me to fish, who had driven 4 hours to see me graduate nursing school, who used to save the sports section of the newspaper for me, even though I never once asked him to, and he was apologizing to me for being left on my porch in the dark. "Come inside," I said. "Come inside right now." He was shaking when I got him through the door, not crying. He wouldn't cry in front of me. That wasn't him, but his hands were shaking, and his lips had that bluish tinge I recognized from my work. And I made him sit in the armchair closest to the heating vent, and I got him tea and a blanket, and I just sat with him for a minute without asking anything. He didn't volunteer much. He said my uncle had decided things needed to change. He said there had been a conversation. He said it was fine. He didn't want to cause problems. I asked how long he'd been sitting outside. He looked away. Not too long. The camera timestamp said 6:19. I had opened the door at 6:51, 32 minutes. 81 years old, 29 degrees. I went to the bathroom and ran the water so he wouldn't hear me, and I stood over the sink for about 30 seconds, doing the thing I do when I need to not fall apart. Slow breath in, hold it, slow breath out, and then I dried my hands and went back out and made us both breakfast. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without context. My grandfather, I've called him Grandpa my whole life, so that's what I'll say here, raised my mother in a small house in western Pennsylvania that he and my grandmother paid off in full by the time my mother was in high school. When my grandmother passed 5 years ago, that house became his. Paid off, no mortgage, worth somewhere around $340,000 by last year's estimates. He also had a pension from 31 years at the mill, a modest amount in savings and Social Security. He was not rich, but he was not helpless, and he was not broke. My uncle, my mother's older brother, had moved back to the area 2 years ago after his second divorce. He had a lot of reasons why things hadn't worked out for him, and he was willing to share all of them at length at any family gathering. He was the kind of person who always had a plan that was just about to pay off. When he moved back, he started visiting Grandpa more. At first, everyone thought it was nice. Grandpa was lonely. He missed my grandmother. My uncle would take him to appointments, mow the lawn, stay for dinner. My mother and I had both noticed we were calling less, not because we didn't want to, but because my uncle had started answering Grandpa's phone and telling us he was resting, or busy, or not feeling up to talking. I should have pushed harder on that. I know that now. About 14 months ago, my grandfather signed a document giving my uncle power of attorney. I found this out not from my grandfather, not from my uncle, but from my grandfather's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Aldrich, who has lived next door to that house for 40 years, and who, bless her, notices everything. She mentioned it to my mother in passing at the post office, thinking we already knew. We did not already know. When my mother tried to bring it up with Grandpa, my uncle was there. He said Grandpa had made a very sensible decision and that it was no one else's business. My grandfather said he was fine with everything and changed the subject to the weather. That was 8 months before he ended up on my porch. In the months between, things got harder to track. Grandpa seemed quieter when we visited. My uncle had opinions about who should come by and when, and he made those opinions known. I started keeping a little log on my phone, nothing formal, just notes. Dates I called, whether Grandpa answered, what he said, what he didn't say. Little things I noticed when I visited. The way my uncle steered him away from certain topics. The way Grandpa would glance at my uncle before he answered certain questions. Old habits from nursing, I guess. You write things down, you notice patterns. You don't assume, but you document. The morning Grandpa showed up on my porch, I helped him eat breakfast, and then I asked him, as gently as I could, whether he could tell me what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. He stirred his tea even though there was nothing in it to stir. Then he said, "Your uncle thinks it would be better if I moved into that facility over on Route 9. He says the house is too much to manage." I asked if he wanted to move there. Another long pause. "It's not really. I don't think it's really my decision to make anymore." I put my hand over his hand and didn't say anything. He looked out the window. He said you wouldn't mind if I stayed here for a while things got sorted. My uncle had not called me, had not texted, had not given me any warning. He had driven my grandfather to my house in the dark and left him on the steps with 2 grocery bags and not even knocked on the door. I waited until Grandpa had dozed off in the armchair, and then I went into the kitchen and called my mother. She didn't know either. She was horrified. She started crying and then got herself together the way she always does, and we talked for almost an hour. At the end of that call, I said, "I need you to not say anything to him yet. Not until I figure out what's been happening." She agreed. The first call I made after I hung up with my mother was to an elder law attorney. I had to leave a message, but she called me back before noon. And by the end of that conversation, I had a very different understanding of what power of attorney actually meant, what it didn't mean, and what legal mechanisms existed if someone was using it inappropriately. The second call I made was to the county's Adult Protective Services. I want to be clear about why I made that second call. Not because I wanted to blow anything up, not because I was angry, though I was, but because I was a nurse and I knew that if one of my patients had described to me what my grandfather had just described, I would have been legally and ethically obligated to report it. My grandfather was family. That didn't make the obligation smaller. The APS intake worker was calm and professional and asked a series of questions I was able to answer in detail, partly because of the log I'd been keeping on my phone. She told me someone would be in touch. That same afternoon, I helped Grandpa get settled in my spare room. He had packed, in his 2 grocery bags, a change of clothes, his blood pressure medication, his reading glasses, a photograph of my grandmother, and a paperback mystery novel he'd been halfway through. That was everything he'd taken from the home he'd lived in for 53 years. "Is this okay?" he asked me, looking around the room. "I don't want to put you out." "You're not putting me out," I said. "This is your room." He patted my hand and then turned away quickly, the way people do when they're trying not to show you their face. 3 days later, my uncle called. He did not call to check on my grandfather. He called to explain the situation, by which he meant he called to explain why he was correct. He said, Grandpa had been struggling to manage on his own. He said the house was going to require significant repairs. He said the facility on Route 9 had a lovely dining room and a whole activities calendar. He said all of this very reasonably, in the tone of someone who had been dealing with a difficult situation that others didn't fully appreciate. I let him talk. Then I asked, "When did you last have a financial discussion with Grandpa about his accounts?" Silence. "Because I'm wondering," I said, "about the savings account he had at First National. He mentioned it to me, and I'm just curious about the balance." I didn't actually know the balance. I was guessing there was something there. Worth finding. My uncle said that was none of my business, and that as power of attorney, he had every right to manage Grandpa's finances. "I understand that," I said. "I just want to make sure Grandpa understands where everything stands. Can we get together with him and go through it?" He said he'd think about it. He never called back. But other things started happening. My uncle drove by my house twice in 1 week, slow, the way you do when you're trying to see if someone's home. Then my mother got a call from him telling her I was stirring things up and that Grandpa had been confused lately and wasn't always reliable about what he remembered. That last part, that Grandpa was confused, was something I'd never heard anyone say before. Not his doctor, not his neighbor, not anyone. It was new and it felt strategic. I called Mrs. Aldrich, my grandfather's neighbor, and asked if she'd be willing to talk to me. She was more than willing. She came over to my mother's house on a Saturday morning and she brought notes of her own. Actual handwritten notes, dates and times, things she'd seen and heard, deliveries she'd watched get carried into the house, a conversation she'd overheard through an open window about the money market account. A locksmith she'd seen at the house on a day she knew Grandpa was at a medical appointment. A locksmith. While Grandpa was at a medical appointment, I photographed all of her notes with my phone. The elder law attorney had by now reviewed what I'd shared with her. She told me that, given what I was describing, there were grounds to petition for a guardianship review, essentially, asking the court to take a look at whether the existing power of attorney was being exercised in my grandfather's interest. She told me it was not a fast process and it was not guaranteed, but she thought we had a solid case. I asked her to file. 6 weeks later, my uncle was served with notice that a review had been requested. He called me 30 minutes after he was served. This call was different from the last one. He wasn't reasonable anymore. He said I was tearing the family apart. He said Grandpa would be devastated when he found out. He said I was doing this out of spite, out of jealousy, and that he knew exactly what kind of person I really was. I let him say everything he wanted to say. Then I said, "I've been recording this call. I want you to know that." More silence. "I'd also like you to know that I'm not doing this behind Grandpa's back. He knows about the petition. He asked me to do it. So if you want to talk about what he would think, I think you should talk to him directly." He hung up. Grandpa had known about the petition. We'd had a long conversation about it. Me, my mother, and him, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. I'd explained everything in plain terms. What a guardianship review was, what it would look at, what he would be asked. I told him he didn't have to agree to any of it, that this was his choice, and that we would support whatever he decided. He had listened to all of it. Then he'd asked me one question. "Will they make me go to that place on Route 9? I said I couldn't promise anything about the outcome, but that the purpose of the review was to make sure that what happened to him was actually what he wanted, and not what someone else wanted for him. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "File it." The court process was, as my attorney had warned, not fast. There were documents and filings, and a court-appointed guardian ad litem, an independent person assigned to represent my grandfather's interests in the proceedings. She was a quiet, careful woman who came to my house twice to speak with my grandfather alone, and who asked me very detailed questions about my documentation. I gave her my phone log, all 14 months of it. She also spoke with Mrs. Aldrich. She also subpoenaed financial records. What those records showed was not subtle. In the 22 months since my uncle had been granted power of attorney, the savings account my grandfather had maintained since 1987 had gone from just over $94,000 to $6,200, not because of medical expenses, not because of home repairs. The withdrawals were in round numbers, spread out, never quite large enough to trigger automatic reporting thresholds. But added up, they were unmistakable. When the Guardian ad litem's report was filed, my uncle's attorney asked for a continuance. Then another one. My grandfather turned 82 in the middle of all of it. We had a small party at my house. My mother, Mrs. Aldrich, a cousin who drove down from Pittsburgh, a coworker of mine who had become fond of him during his months staying with me. He ate 2 pieces of chocolate cake and beat everyone at gin rummy and went to bed at 9 o'clock. He didn't talk about the case. He talked about a baseball game he'd watched that afternoon and whether my mother's potato salad was better this year than last year. He was happy. That night, after everyone left, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and thought about how close it had been. If I hadn't checked the camera app that morning, if I had rolled over and gone back to sleep, if it had been 10 degrees colder, or if he'd had a health episode out there on the steps, or if he had tried to walk somewhere instead of waiting. I had to stand there for a minute. The court ruling came 4 months after the petition was filed. My uncle was removed as power of attorney. A professional fiduciary, a neutral third party, was appointed to manage my grandfather's finances going forward. The court also referred the financial records to the district attorney's office for review. I don't know exactly what will come of that. Those things move slowly. But the referral was made, it's on record, and my grandfather's remaining money is no longer accessible to anyone without court oversight. The house is still his. He went back to it, which surprised me a little. I'd half expected him to decide he liked the spare room, but he said he wanted to be in the house he and my grandmother had built together, and I understood that completely. Mrs. Aldrich checked on him. My mother calls every morning. I drive out on weekends. His Social Security and pension have been deposited into a new account that my uncle cannot touch. The professional fiduciary handles the bills. Everything is documented, and I still keep my notes on my phone, because that's just who I am now. My uncle sent me one text, 3 days after the ruling. It said, "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family." I thought about what to say for about a day and a half. Then I wrote back, "Grandpa is home. He's safe. He's happy. I'm very happy." I didn't hear back after that. The thing I think about most, not the money, not the legal process, not even the morning I found him on the steps, is that moment when he looked up at me in the dark and apologized for being there. This man who had never asked for anything, who had spent 80 years taking care of other people, sitting on cold concrete with 2 grocery bags, saying sorry for existing in a space where he needed help. He shouldn't have had to do that. He shouldn't have had to be in that position at all. If you have someone elderly in your life, a grandparent, a parent, a neighbor, and something feels off, trust that feeling. Document it. Call someone. Call your local adult protective services. Call an elder law attorney. Call anyone. You don't have to be certain something is wrong to ask questions. You just have to be willing to ask them. I was 4 hours of sleep and almost didn't check my phone. That still scares me. But I checked. And he's home, and every Sunday when I drive out and he opens the door in that gray cardigan with the re-sewn buttons, he smiles at me like I've given him something extraordinary. I haven't. I just showed up. That should never be extraordinary. But sometimes it is.